Hello, grade 9 class. You're working on the chapter 4 assignment currently. There's a section in the chapter 4 assignment that might be a little bit confusing for a number of students. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going over this timeline. Uh, the timeline is titled Timeline of Two Views of the Numbered Treaties. It says the next 7 pages present a timeline spanning more than a century. Here's how to use the timeline. The top of each page presents information about the perspectives of First Nations. So the green is going to be First Nations on the numbered treaties. Most of these perspectives come from the First Nations in Alberta, covered by treaties 6, 7, and 8. Analyze these for evidence that the First Nations viewed and continue to view the treaties as a nation-to-nation agreements that establish rights. Use an organizer like the one below. Now, on your worksheet, okay, you're going to have something similar. Now, before I get to the worksheet, let's just look at the blue. The blue represents the government's perspective. The bottom of each page presents information about the views of Canada's government on the numbered treaties. Analyze these for evidence that Canada's government has had different views of treaty rights over time. Once again, use an organizer like the one below, and you'll see the organizer in your Chapter 6 worksheet. All right, so let's have a look at the worksheet. Now, on the worksheet, it shows you an exemplar, and I will show you the exemplar in the textbook here in a moment. You have on the top here, you have the green, which is the First Nations perspective. On the bottom, you have the blue, which is the Canadian government perspective. And it does this throughout all those pages. So let's go back to the textbook. So 1876 and 1876, you'll notice that that exemplar is provided for you. Okay, you will read the First Nations perspective, like I said, on top, and then the Canadian government perspective now on the bottom. You go through it and you need to answer a few questions. What's the source of the first perspective, the First Nations perspective? And that would be the Cree spokesman, okay, about the terms of Treaty 6 in August of 1876. Then you need to identify what's the main idea of that source. Treaty is permanent, secure in the future, okay? And you would get that from reading that source, that time period, etc. And then you need to identify, does this affirm or support the First Nations people? And they would say yes. Okay, going down to the bottom of that page, now you have the Canadian government perspective from the same time. You read through this source, you need to identify that the source is Alexander Morris in 1876, which you would put here, Alexander Morris, Treaty 6 negotiations. Once again, the main idea, treaty is permanent, First Nations should learn European ways, First Nations can keep traditional ways. Does it affirm the First Nations? You could probably argue yes and no. Okay, perhaps provide a little bit of a reason why. All right, so that's the one that is done for you. You go on to the worksheet, now you have the first set that you need to do. 1910 would be the First Nations, 1876 Indian Act would be the Canadian government, the respective comparison. Where you find that now is on the next page. So for the first set of questions, once again, the green would be the First Nations, 1910 photo would be the perspective, okay? And once again, get the main idea from it. And sometimes the perspective is from a person, sometimes the perspective is from a photograph, a quote, or whatever. You just do your best on what's the source itself. Okay, is the source a picture? Is the source a chart? Is the source a person? That's up to you to decide from looking at that section. All right, so once again, you write in 1910 Treaty 6. The source would be You look through the information. The only source that really comes up here would be the photograph from 1910. Okay. You need to, give me the main idea. What are some of the main ideas you get out of that photograph and from the reading? Okay. Does it affirm? Generally, most of the First Nations sources, I would imagine, would affirm First Nations, would support it. Okay. Whereas, at least initially, the sources that the Canadian government had would not affirm First Nations. So you've done that one. Now on the bottom, the Canadian government, the 1876 Indian Act, you would read the little blurb that is found on the bottom of this page. What's the source? That would be the Indian Act. What's some of the main ideas? You would read that paragraph and kind of derive a main idea. And then once again, does the Indian Act, at least in 1876, affirm First Nations? I would argue no. Okay, so you have that one. Now you go on to the next one. You have the next set. So you would go to the next page. Once again, the top would be the First Nations one perspective, 1920s, 1930s, Treaty 7. So they give you an approximate date. You need to now find the source. Maybe the source, you try to find some sort of source here. The source would be the undated photo. Okay. And then down here, 1879 residential schools, a source here would be the report on the industrial schools for Indians and half-breeds by Nicholas Flood Davin. Okay. Or another source could be these photos of Thomas More. Once again, you got a source. You have to identify the main idea found in the source. Does the source affirm First Nations? Once again, generally, the First Nations sources and perspectives try to affirm them, whereas the Canadian government, at least, like I said, for the most part, did not try to affirm First Nations. So you have that one. So you go to the next one. And once again, you go to the next set right here, 1939, 1946, and you can see that here, 1939, 1946. Identify a source. Okay, what's the main idea? Does it affirm? Go down here. Now you have the Canadian government equivalent, 1939, source, main idea, affirm, etc. You continue on. You got 1970 and 1969. So here's the 1970 First Nations perspective source, and then the 1969 Canadian government source perspective affirms, etc. Continuing on, you have 1980 as the First Nations perspective. Okay, once again, a source could be a person, a photograph, a quote. Okay, it's different every time. Okay, and then here's the Canadian government source from 1982, the Constitution. Okay, and of course, the source would be Prime Minister Trudeau at that time. Okay, and that, I think there might be one other. I think mine is a little bit different than yours as far as the page numbers, but that's essentially what is done. Okay, I think there's one that doesn't show up on the PDF version, but that's it. I know it seems a little bit difficult and it's not explained very well. And that's the beauty of me being in a classroom with kids is I actually can sit down and talk to them about that. But since that's not there, this is kind of the best we can do. All right, hopefully that helped. I know a couple people have asked about this one and I just felt it was necessary to make a quick video. And once again, stay safe. And if you have any other questions, I will fire off videos as soon as I can. All right, take care.